All right, real talk. Today I want to tell you about a man the world thought was soft. Gentle voice, shy smile, always polite. But cross him, disrespect him, or come for his family, his art, or his name, and a completely different man showed up. Tomorrow I'm bringing you another story connected to this one, so stick around for that. But today, we're talking about Michael Jackson and the 10 moments he proved that kindness was never the same thing as weakness. He was the most famous face on the planet. 3 out of every 4 people alive during his prime could recognize him instantly. Even now, decades later, his name still stops a room. But there's a version of Michael Jackson most people never got to see. Not the dancer, not the icon, not the tabloid punchline. The version who drew a line and dared anyone to cross it. People close to him say the same thing over and over. Michael Jackson was not a fighter by nature. He avoided conflict. He smiled through pressure that would have broken most people. But make no mistake, patience was not the same as tolerance. And when someone finally pushed too far, he didn't yell. He didn't panic. He simply made sure they never made that mistake again. Here are 10 times the world found that out the hard way. The year was 2002. Michael climbed onto an open-top bus in central London, and the street below turned into a sea of noise. Then he lifted a poster over his head, a caricature of Sony Music chairman Tommy Mottola, drawn with horns, a tail, and a pitchfork. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a declaration of war. Behind the scenes, Sony had allegedly starved the promotion of his Invincible album on purpose, a calculated squeeze designed to pressure Michael into giving up his stake in the Sony/ATV catalog, a stake worth hundreds of millions, and including the rights to the Beatles' music. Michael saw the play immediately. Standing in front of thousands of fans, he called Mottola a racist and a corporate predator who built his empire on the backs of black artists. Most performers in his position would have quietly negotiated through lawyers, terrified of angering the biggest label on earth. Michael did the opposite. He said the name out loud, on camera, in public. Then he walked away from the label entirely, choosing to release music as an independent artist rather than stay silent for a paycheck. For Michael, the catalog was never just business. It represented decades of black artists being managed instead of respected. He wasn't going to let that slide, no matter who was sitting in the executive chair. Those close to him say the frustration had been building for years. He'd spent 5 years in a fortune building Invincible, and when it only sold 5 million copies against the 100 million standard set by Thriller, he felt the label had quietly worked against him rather than admit the industry had changed. People who worked with him remember him on the phone, furious, threatening lawsuits worth hundreds of millions, then locking himself away afterward, overwhelmed by the feeling that years of his life had been taken from him. The London bus wasn't a sudden outburst. It was the release valve for a pressure that had been building far longer than the public ever saw. 90 million people tuned in. It was 1993, and Oprah Winfrey sat across from Michael inside Neverland Ranch, cameras rolling, no safety net. Oprah didn't hold back. She pushed into the most sensational headlines of the moment, the crotch grab on stage, questions about his personal life, anything that might make him stumble on live television. It was, by design, an ambush dressed up as an interview. Michael didn't flinch. When asked about the dance move that tabloids had turned into a scandal, he calmly explained that it wasn't calculated. It was instinct, a physical reaction to the rhythm moving through him, the same way a jazz musician might close their eyes and let the music take over. It was less an answer and more a lesson in musicianship, delivered so smoothly that one of the most formidable interviewers in television history had nothing left to say. He had walked into a trap built to expose him, and walked out having reframed the entire narrative, not through anger, but through composure. That night, a lot of people watching at home saw someone very different from the caricature they'd been sold. This wasn't a one-off skill. In interview after interview, Michael used the same quiet strategy against reporters who tried to bait him. Asked point blank whether he felt disrespected by constant tabloid coverage of his private life, he'd simply say it felt like watching a piece of science fiction, a story about someone who wasn't really him. He rarely raised his voice defending himself because he genuinely believed the truth would eventually outlast the headlines. That patience wasn't passivity. It was its own kind of discipline, and it frustrated interviewers far more than an angry outburst ever could have. During a 1996 concert in Brunei, Michael was mid-performance of "I Just Can't Stop Loving You" when the arrangement suddenly shifted. He stopped, turned toward the pit, and, with his mic still live for the entire arena to hear, called out to his musical director, "What are you going to do?" To thousands of fans in the crowd, it sounded like a public reprimand. In reality, It was something far more controlled. Michael had intentionally broken from the song to improvise an acoustic, near a cappella breakdown with his backing vocalists, and he was cueing the band to hold back until his signal. It wasn't anger, it was direction, delivered in real time, in front of an audience that had no idea they were watching a live edit happen in front of them. Even in a moment of pure improvisation, nothing was left to chance. Every second of that stage belonged to him, and everyone on it knew it. Cameras were rolling during what should have been a routine studio session. Michael was locked into deep focus. And then the noise started. Loud chatter from his own sister, LaToya, drifting into the room. Most people would let family slide. Michael didn't. He turned, calm but firm, and asked for the door to be closed, telling her plainly that the noise was distracting him. No shouting, no drawn-out argument, just an unmistakable boundary, enforced without hesitation, even with someone he loved. That clip is often mistaken for a tense moment from the height of their public falling out years later, but it actually dates back to the Jacksons' earliest studio days, long before any real rift existed. It was closer to ordinary sibling friction than a declaration of war. Still, it captured something true about Michael. Inside his creative space, respect wasn't optional for anyone, family included. Love and professionalism were two different currencies, and he never confused the two. Long before he was a global icon, Michael was a child standing in a room while his father held a belt. Rehearsals in the Jackson household were not optional, and mistakes carried consequences that had nothing to do with music. Michael absorbed every bit of that fear silently, and he never forgot it. The moment he had power of his own, he acted. He removed Joe from every position of authority in his career, cut him out of his finances, and kept him at arm's length for the rest of his life. It wasn't a public feud or a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, permanent, and total severing of control. Neverland Ranch itself became a kind of answer to that childhood, a place built entirely around wonder and safety, the exact things Michael felt he'd been denied. When Joe later resurfaced at press events trying to leverage his son's name for business ventures, it only underlined why Michael had fought so hard to build distance in the first place. Some forms of disrespect start at home, and Michael made sure that particular one never got another chance. In 2004, Eminem released a music video mocking Michael's likeness, his changing appearance, and the allegations that had already put him through one of the hardest chapters of his life. The timing was deliberate, and it landed while Michael was already fighting for his reputation in court. He didn't respond with a diss track. He picked up the phone. Michael reached out to Stevie Wonder and other major figures across the industry, quietly building support for a coordinated pushback against BET for airing the video. The pressure worked. The network pulled it, and Eminem later admitted the whole thing had been a mistake he regretted. What makes the story even more striking is what came out years afterward. Michael had reportedly acquired publishing rights connected to some of Eminem's catalog, meaning the artist who once mocked him had, in some capacity, needed his approval just to keep his own songs in rotation. Michael never framed it as revenge. He said simply that artists shouldn't tear each other down, but he still made sure the lesson landed. Years later, Eminem publicly said he wished he'd made peace with Michael before he passed. By most accounts, Michael was genuinely hurt rather than just angry. He'd admired Eminem's talent for years and said it was painful to be attacked by someone he respected as an artist, someone who understood better than most what it felt like to be judged by the public. He didn't ask for an apology and never publicly gloated once the leverage tipped in his favor. When people around him later brought up that Eminem had gone into retirement, Michael's first reaction wasn't satisfaction. It was surprise, almost concern, that things had gone that far. He wanted respect between artists, not a rival's downfall. He got both anyway. In the early 1980s, MTV had an unspoken rule. Black artists didn't get heavy rotation, no matter how big the record was. Billie Jean was breaking sales records across the country, and the network still wouldn't play it. Michael didn't write an open letter or give an interview about racism in the industry. Alongside CBS Records chief Walter Yetnikoff, he issued a direct ultimatum: pull every CBS artist's video from MTV's airwaves unless Michael Jackson got his rotation slot. It was an all-or-nothing threat aimed squarely at the network's entire catalog of programming. MTV backed down almost immediately. Billie Jean entered rotation, and weeks later, MTV aired Thriller, arguably the most influential music video ever made. A policy that had quietly shut out black artists for years was broken in a matter of days, not through protest, but through leverage. Michael understood that some battles aren't won with words. They're won by making yourself impossible to ignore. Few people knew there was tension between Michael and Prince, but those who were in the room that night saw it up close. During a private event, Prince walked off the stage, crossed the room with purpose, and got inches from Michael's face, then launched into an aggressive, pointed bass solo aimed directly at him. It wasn't musical admiration, it was a challenge delivered in public in front of witnesses. Michael left the event almost immediately, visibly rattled by the intrusion into his space. The next morning, he kept pressing people close to him with the same question. Why had Prince done that? It wasn't a passing comment. It was the reaction of someone who took every ounce of disrespect seriously, even from a peer the public assumed he got along with. Behind the polished public image, the two icons had a rivalry that ran far deeper than most fans ever realized. And that night, Michael made it clear he hadn't forgotten it. Nobody in that Munich stadium in 1999 saw it coming. Mid-performance of Earth Song at a benefit concert, a mechanical bridge Michael was standing on gave way and dropped roughly 50 feet, slamming into the stage below. The crowd gasped. Smoke filled the air. Michael suffered severe spinal bruising in the fall, and then he got up, climbed back onto the main stage, and finished the song, every lyric, every note, before finally collapsing into a waiting ambulance the second the performance ended. It wasn't about proving toughness for its own sake. Michael refused to let a mechanical failure turn a charity event into chaos, and he refused to let his audience walk away with an unfinished show. Disrespect, in his mind, wasn't only something other people did to him. It was anything, including his own pain, that threatened to get between him and the people who came to see him perform. By 2004, the media had already decided what image they wanted from Michael's arraignment at the Santa Barbara courthouse: a broken man, head down, spirit finally crushed under the weight of the case against him. Every camera in the country was pointed at him, waiting for exactly that shot. He gave them the opposite. Michael climbed onto the roof of his SUV in full view of the press, and thousands of supporters danced and threw up peace signs before ever stepping toward the building. It wasn't denial, and it wasn't a stunt for sympathy. It was a message aimed directly at everyone expecting him to fold. Whatever the outcome of the case, his spirit wasn't something a headline could take from him. Reporters were caught completely off guard. Nobody had scripted that moment, and nobody controlled it but him. The nickname Banther's one more story worth telling before we close, because it shows just how far Michael was willing to go to protect his name. For years, tabloids on both sides of the Atlantic had reduced him to a nickname, Wacko Jacko, printed across front pages like it was harmless fun. Michael let it slide for a long time. Then he called a press conference and made himself unmistakably clear. Any outlet that kept using that phrase would lose all access to him, permanently. No interviews, no red carpets, no press pool invitations, nothing. For publications that depended on his image to sell papers, that was a real threat, and most of them fell in line almost overnight. It wasn't about vanity. Around the same period, he channeled the same frustration into art instead of lawsuits, releasing the short film Leave Me Alone, a music video that turned every ridiculous headline written about him, the oxygen chamber, the bone-buying rumors, into a surreal carnival he danced through, grinning the entire time. He took the exact stories designed to humiliate him and turned them into one of the most inventive videos of his career. It was disrespect, repackaged as art, and it outlasted every tabloid that had printed the original lies. There was a similar moment behind the scenes that never made headlines the way it should have. During a chaotic paparazzi scrum, someone pointed out a reporter from a British tabloid who'd written a particularly damaging, fabricated story about him. Witnesses say Michael's calm cracked for a second. He pulled his arm back to swing before security stopped him, reminding him what a single punch caught on camera would do to his image. He backed down immediately and later thanked the people who'd stopped him. It's a small moment, but it says something bigger. Even the most controlled public figure of his era had a limit, and years of being lied about had brought him right up to it. Michael Jackson spent most of his life being underestimated. People saw the soft voice and the quiet demeanor and assumed there was nothing underneath but fragility. But time and again, with record labels, with tabloids, with family, with rival artists, and even with his own body failing him mid-performance, he proved that gentleness and tolerance are not the same thing. He picked his battles carefully, and when he fought, he rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply made sure the people who crossed him understood unmistakably that they had made a mistake. That's the Michael Jackson history doesn't talk about enough. Not just the artist, but the man who knew exactly where his lines were and never let anyone forget it. Think about how many of these moments happened in public, under the harshest spotlight imaginable, with no room for a second take. A record label trying to squeeze him out of his own legacy. A television host aiming her sharpest questions directly at him. A media machine that had already decided who he was before he ever opened his mouth. In almost every case, Michael had two options: react in anger and hand his critics exactly the headline they wanted, or respond with control and take the story back on his own terms. 9 times out of 10, he chose the second option, and it's part of why so many of these moments still get talked about decades later. Restraint, used correctly, can hit harder than rage ever could. It's also worth remembering that the people who knew him personally, bodyguards, band members, family, collaborators, described two sides of the same man. There was the soft-spoken artist who apologized for raising his voice even a little, and there was the person who had been trained since childhood not to be anyone's easy target. Both of those things were true at once, and that contradiction is exactly why he was so hard to predict. People who assumed his gentleness meant he wouldn't push back usually found out otherwise, once, and never made that mistake twice. If this kind of story hit different, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video picks up right where this one leaves off.